Hello, Verity.
Hello.
I'm Adam. Thanks for joining us. You're one of our speakers today at the SEA conference. So I have the title of your talk here. You better say it actually with me.
La thérapie, no, it starts. La vie, la thérapie et ma poeme.
Wow, life, therapy and my poeme.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about that, Verity.
Well, it's in French because I come from France.
Right.
I've been working for 30 years in France.
Right.
In a land it would be surprising for existential therapists to know, but there's no training in existential therapy.
There's no existential therapy training in France?
No place at all. And the training I offer over 2 years is for already trained people from different schools of
Maybe from different modalities?
Very different modalities, and child psychiatrists, therapists and clinical psychologists.
I get the sense it's quite an experiential training and it's creative. I was dancing with you at the back of the room a little bit earlier. Yeah. Tell me a bit about that side.
That's part of me, and I can talk
Right.
about that, but it's also part of the fact that when I started 30 years ago then in France, I found all the people who came and what they expected of my training to be very intellectual, lots of discussions at the intellectual level, and actually most of them, because they were already trained, were interested in developing a much more creative way of working, especially I work with children and adolescents and adults.
Yes.
And they were often very unprepared for that, but interested in doing that.
Yeah.
And the more I offered experiential training, including approaching all sorts of fundamental existential issues.
Right, so it's informed by existentialism, but it's got more of an openness to different...
No, it's actually, I talk about the base as a philosophy, which is why the word vie.
Vie as life.
Everyday life, and I'm very keen always to encourage people to bring back a bit more life into a therapeutic
Bringing a life, yes.
So,
bring it to life.
Yes, bring it to life, and to not, and this is very difficult in that setting where I was training people not to all the time be focused on the presenting problems and the difficulties, but to talk about the potentiality of the child and all that is there. And if you offer a much more creative way of working, and for me that's creative working with adults, which I find is lacking a lot in existential therapy, but also, I'll just add, when I come to Britain, it's encouraging existential therapists and mostly adults to work far more creatively.
Such as myself.
Yes. And also to encourage existential therapists to realise that many of the philosophy that is existential is very appropriate for working with children.
So as an existential therapist that works just with adults, would you give me any advice? What would you tell me? How would you help me bring that to life?
Well, that's why my training is very experiential, because I do believe there's a lot of work we should do ourselves on our embodiment. There's a lot of different kinds of corporal work in my training. Of all the four dimensions.
Corporal work,
yes, body work, if you like.
Yes.
And work with all sorts of different media, like clay, paint, painting on walls, and things. So that when I say walls, a special
wall,
a special place on the wall. There are all sorts of different things which are open for anybody who comes, of whatever age, to come into. It's called a practice workshop in English.
Yes, sure.
The practice workshop is a place where there are lots of different media ready at hand.
For expression.
Ready at hand for people to choose to use or not. And the therapist can show a little, but especially at the beginning, the idea is to stay as a therapist very much in a phenomenological attitude, and what I call a more trialogical rather than dialogical attitude, because basically therapists in general, and I consider a lot of existential adults also, the dialogical way we talk about therapy is actually sedentary, face-to-face, and verbal.
Yes.
And so all the rest, which is absolutely fundamental to help people get back into the vibrancy of life.
The body, the rest of the things other than the brain.
So my training is really to encourage therapists to work this through for themselves.
It sounds extraordinary. I want to join your training. But one of the questions I had, and I'm just going to modify it slightly for you, because my question was describe existentialism in 3 words. But I wonder if you could express existentialism in a movement, and I'll join you.
Can I say one of the things I did? Because I tried to present mostly through movement and metaphor in my presentation.
Yes.
One movement, if you'd like to
Sure,
try it,
I'll try.
is a movement, but this we did with a piece of cord on the ground, so it's
Right.
different.
Yeah.
One movement is opening into a clearing, which is Heidegger's metaphor.
Opening into a clearing.
Is it not? Opening
Yes.
into some kind of clearing. So we were preparing the clearing, coming in.
Okay.
Okay, well, I won't go through the details.
No,
of the metaphor,
sure.
but that is one.
Thank you.
And what the question?
Well, it's existentialism as embodied and as a
As a
movement.
movement, yes. As a movement.
You've given us an opening. Is there something else that you'd want to suggest? What is
I'm trying now to think of a way, because it matters so much to me, to help my students work creatively through themselves through existential themes, which they won't normally, many of them covered even in their own personal therapy,
Yes.
nor will they have in training.
Existential themes of, I think of
Okay,
life and
exactly,
death,
yes,
and
I'm
meaning,
trying-
meaningless, isolation, all these.
All of these things. And I have a way of working with these creatively, with
Right.
drawing
Right.
with different mediums. So I was trying to think of
Wow.
But I
Well,
have lots of different gestures, but the notion of opening,
Yes.
the other one I showed, there were different, I have a complete chain of gestures that introduce my whole way of my conceptual
it's so,
notion.
I'm really drawn to it, Verity. There's so much I want to hear and so much for you to say, but we're limited. But as ever, like a session, the time comes down and we must stop there. But thank you for that, and thank you so much for joining us today and talking to
pleasure.
us. Brilliant. Thanks.